thank you all for joining us this evening. Wait, I've got, okay. Boy, 30 people without anything else to do in their lives. That shows you what the pandemic will do. Well, so you can tell what generation I'm from, because my subtitle for this evening is you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you just might find you get what you need. And your first clue along those lines is the picture of Mount Baker that you saw online. You'll never do that climb, and that's because that picture is from July of 1977. And if you want to see something really interesting, go and do an online search for retreat of South Cascade Glacier. It's been monitored closely over a very long period of time, and you'll see how much change occurred in our glaciers, particularly what you'll see from 1979, just a little after the picture of mine on Mount Baker, and 2003. And that doesn't even include the last 15 years where the rate of change has been greatly accelerated by record years of heat. But my goal tonight is not so much to give you beta on a climb, or 2 climbs, or 4 climbs. I'm looking to share more of the big things that I've learned, and I'm going to use the rescue on Baker, which was not on the headwall. I've never been on the Colman Headwall, unfortunately, and the climb of Sir Donald, which in fact I have done, which I could cover pretty quickly, but I'm going to take us down a few rabbit holes that I hope you'll find interesting and illuminating.
Hey, Bob.
So, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. We're not seeing what you're presenting.
Well, I'm presenting as a talking head.
Okay, fair enough.
You can see, if you can see me,
That's
then
all.
you've already seen too much.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
And I was just going to apologize in advance for being a talking head and not having a lot of exciting pictures to accompany what will turn out to be more of a fireside chat without the fire. My wife and I we're in between moving homes. We're in a rental home. Most of what I have is in storage. That includes any pictures I have. And in fact, those pictures were Kodachrome slides for the most part. And they've never been digitized. So I'm hoping that you know, out of 30 people, if there were, well, including Twyla and whoever's recording this, that maybe 2 more people stay awake through the end. So it was 1979, and a couple of buddies and I had been wanting to do the Colman Headwall, but we wanted to do it as a real ice climb. You know, most of the early season, it's a snow climb. And I had read Omi Diver's description, his write-up of his 1936 first descent of Liberty Ridge. So if you, and in that, the reason he chose late September to do that climb was because he felt that there would be the least amount of ice fall from the edge of Willis Wall and Liberty Ridge. And keep in mind that none of those well, I shouldn't say none, 2 weeks earlier, his teacher, Wolf Bauer, who taught the second climbing course for the Mountaineers, a couple of young Mountaineers begged him to teach a climbing course. So the first year in 35, he taught it. And then the second year, he had divided it into basic and intermediate students. Omi was in that second year group with Lloyd Anderson, who was the founder of REI, and who 4 years later taught that course. And one of his students was a guy named Fred Becky. So Omi decided he wanted to do that climb late September. They were on the route. Well, the climb was 4 days long, including the ascent and descent. It ended October 1st. And he was climbing with maybe 12 or 10-point crampons, a straight pick ice axe, because Chenard didn't come up with a curved pick ice axe until sometime in, I think, the late 60s. And he would have cut a shitload of steps. And any ice screws he had would have been the diameter of a pencil. They would have been this elongated P, and at the maybe bottom inch and a half would have had some screw threads on them. And God forbid you ever had I've seen old ones that have taken falls and were just, bent like that. And who even knew if they held. But in any event, we wanted to do the Colman Headwall under these kinds of icy conditions. So it would be a real ice climb. And we decided to do it the first weekend in October, which is Columbus Day weekend. And Columbus Day weekend, we didn't realize at that time, was also Canadian Thanksgiving. And I can honestly say it was Thanksgiving, at least for one climber. So we had great weather. We headed out on Saturday morning. We found ourselves up onto the glacier in the relatively early-ish afternoon. We're heading up, and maybe, 600-700 feet above us, there is a party that we spot coming down from the standard route. And we're working our way up, and something catches my eye. I just sort of, in my peripheral vision, sense some motion, and I look up, and I don't see this other party. I turn around to my partners, and I ask them, did you see another party up there? And they did, but none of us could spot where they were, and we should have been able to. So we made a group decision, let's head over their way. And we found them a couple of 100 feet uphill in a big mess. The two of them were lying at the bottom of what I describe as the world's smallest bergschrund. They had come downhill, and all of a sudden there was like a 5-foot drop. Under that 5-foot drop, there was a crevasse that was filled in to maybe within a foot of the lip. And there they were in this filled in crevasse. And I had just completed what was at the time through the Everett chapter, the first that I knew of advanced MOFA course. This was before, all these remote wilderness kinds of first aid courses existed. And Ted Case, I remember, was the instructor. And I had also guided earlier. So I took that in the spring. I had also done some guiding earlier that summer. And so I ended up being the rescue leader on this rescue we found ourselves in the middle of. And we did all the usual things. We made sure, none of us were at risk at that point. My two partners each took one of the accident victims. They started doing assessments. I came up with a plan, and on my harness was a whistle, which I took off my harness, and I started sending out blasts of 3, signaling for help, because I could see in the far distance there was some unknown number of people. Well, it turned out there was 30 students taking a climbing course from Simon Fraser University, and they were there because it was Thanksgiving weekend in Canada. And thankfully they were there, and they started heading over. Well, before they ever arrived, these 2 young bucks showed up. I was 31 at the time. I would say that one of them was 21, and and he had quite an attitude and said, well, you know, I was a Rainier guide, and what we need to do is we need to make a litter and we need to carry these guys out. And I said, no, that's not our plan. And so it sort of turned into this somewhat tense situation where the vibe was go find your own rescue or do what we want you to do. And eventually they caught on that they weren't going to argue with a guy who started climbing in New York and had more attitude than they did. And I sent them down to Culshan Cabin because I knew from having guided on Baker that there was a two-way radio in Culshan Cabin. Now today, I would pull out my cell phone. I would pull out my PLB, and I would have told these guys to take a hike. But this was 1979, and none of those things existed. There was no phone with a long enough cord to be where we were. So we started to do an assessment on them after we sent these two guys down to Culshan. And one of the guys was clearly in worse shape than the other. And it turned out what we learned from the older climber, who was the more experienced climber, who had been a weekend warrior, but it had been a number of years. He hadn't gotten out that much, but he had told stories to his young next door neighbor who was a friend of his. And the next thing you know, they make a decision that they will go and do a climb of the standard Colman Deming route on Baker on Thanksgiving weekend. Well, that was all well and good. They summited and they're coming down. And I can tell you that for those of you who have not been on any of the big volcanoes or any of the glaciers, when it is after a hot summer, but before the snow arrives and there's no fern left on the glacier, that this was a very hard ice surface. So they're coming downhill. Of course, it's not all that steep. It might have only been 25 or 30 degrees, but the problem was that the experienced climber either forgot or never knew that coming downhill, he was supposed to be behind his inexperienced partner, not leading in front. So his inexperienced partner is, however much rope they had out between them above him, he slips. Of course, he cannot stop himself. I don't know that I could have stopped myself. And he goes flying past his partner, pulls him off, and they both go however many feet and come off the edge of this little schrund and get stopped in this flat spot in this filled-in crevasse. So we're doing the things we need to do. We're dealing with shock. We're dealing with each one of them is talking about having back pain. Well, as all of you know from your wilderness or MOFA or whatever training, somebody talks to you about back pain. Well, you got to worry about spinal injury. You got to worry about cervical injury. You've been through all kinds of training on how to move these people, roll these people, etc. But the first thing we need to do is we're going to be here for a while. We need to deal with hypothermia and get them onto some mattresses and or into sleeping bags, depending upon how much, or at least cover them in sleeping bags, but get them some insulation, top and bottom. So that's what we're working on doing. And then the folks from Simon Fraser show up. And before they show up, the younger guy who is in the worst condition. He passes out and stops breathing. And so now my partner and I, the partner who is tasked with focusing on him and I, start doing CPR. The Simon Fraser people arrive, and now I back off of that and I work out a cyclical rotation with those of them who have CPR training, so that it's not this great burden. The truth of the matter is we had this guy on CPR for hours. If anybody tells you you can't do CPR for more than X number of minutes, that's like saying you can't put someone on a ventilator for more than X number of minutes. You can do it if you've got enough manpower, and we were really, really lucky that we had all that manpower.
So Bob, real quick,
yeah.
The Simon Fraser students, there you mentioned there were like 30 of them earlier.
Yeah.
So you had all 30 of them like going through and
not all 30
CPR?
had CPR certification.
Oh, okay, yeah.
We probably had at least a dozen.
Okay, well that's still better than just the 2 rescuers. So.
Oh, it
Yeah.
was. I mean, it was like a well that never ran dry.
Yeah. Okay,
So-
and then I also just wanted to take this moment, since I've already interrupted you, to let people know that they can like turn on their video and like ask questions as you have them as well, since this is more of like a fireside chat and Bob's not really
sure.
like presenting any slides.
You bet. I'm happy to be interactive as we go along. And then I thought I'd stop at the end of the Baker part and just open it up to other questions. And then we'll move on to the Sir Donald part. I figured we'd start with the worst of times and move on to the best of times. So yes, people have questions. Don't hesitate to jump in. So we're doing CPR on this one guy, and it's now been, I want to say at least a couple of hours. The light is starting to drop on us, and we're getting concerned, but we're doing what we need to do. Meanwhile, the older climber, his back is more and more painful. And the next thing we know, he also goes unconscious. And we start doing CPR. Now we're doing CPR on both of them. We have no idea what's going on with these guys. All we know is we've got 2 people who need CPR, and that we're being successful at keeping them going. And we're hoping that the helicopter or somebody, the cavalry, is going to arrive soon. And off in the distance, we start to hear the chopper, and there's a Huey coming from Whidbey. And as we're doing all the CPR, I am seeing this helicopter in the distance, and it's just sort of wandering. And it's getting closer, but it's wandering. It's not like it's coming to us. It is here, it's there, it's going away from us. It's going around to the wrong direction. So I pulled out of my pack I don't know if any of you are old enough to be able to relate to what a 35 millimeter film canister looks like, but it's cylindrical, and it's about a 1.5 inches high and about 1 inch in diameter. It was handy if you were done with the film, you could put your grass in there. That worked well. And
Actually have some film.
there you
I have a
go.
film canister and then
Right.
the grass container that goes with it.
Perfect. You got grass in there? So
No, I do not. Still
Yeah,
holding
okay.
the film.
no weed. Okay, no weed. So I noticed you didn't open to show us, but in any event, so I had a smoke canister that was basically the size of that film canister, and went over and found as flat a spot as I can find within 100 yards of us, and opened that up. And as soon as the smoke started coming out, I'd say within a minute, the chopper's coming right to us. So chopper came down. We're still doing CPR on both people. EMTs come out of the chopper. They've got litters. We're feeling great. We tell them, listen, this guy's in worse shape than that guy. Get him out of here first. We're all transferring him into the litter, and the guy, we can't aspirate him. We can't force air into him. I won't describe what it was like, but I can tell you that there was suddenly a visible sign that bet your bottom dollar this guy's dead. And the EMTs took over, got him into the helicopter. Then we started moving the second climber into a litter, doing CPR, give him over to the EMTs. They take over, they move him into the helicopter. And now here we are, and it's getting darker. It's getting towards dusk. Our sleeping bags have just gone bye-bye in the helicopter, at least 2 of the 3 of ours. And they told us they were taking them. We asked, they told us these guys are going to Bellingham General Hospital. So we thanked the folks from Simon Fraser, and my buddies and I headed down to our car. We got there after dark. Two of us didn't have our sleeping bags. We had a cold bivvy, and we woke up really early and headed down to Bellingham Hospital. And we spoke to the ER doc, who happened to have been there when they arrived and who took care of them, happened to still be on duty. And he was happy to talk to us. So we asked him how they were. He said, well, one of the guys arrived, he was dead on arrival. And the other, you saved his life. There's absolutely no way he would have made it if he had stayed on that mountain even another hour, because he had the same problem as the first guy had. It's just that his was not as severe, but was just as fatal. And so that was the first time I had ever heard of a tension pneumothorax. And however many first aid classes I have ever been through, I have never heard of a tension pneumothorax. And so here is a climbing accident where 2 of 2 climbers have the same problem. And so part of my mission when I talk to the climbers is to make sure that, especially when I get to deal with groups, you know, if I was leading an intermediate climb or a basic climb, whatever climbs I might lead, anybody who was on that climb left that climb knowing what a tension pneumothorax was. Because unfortunately, it is never mentioned in first aid. And the reason it's not mentioned in first aid is because the only thing that you can do about it is get that person treated ASAP by a physician. So now you're going to learn what a tension pneumothorax is, to the extent that an idiot like me can explain it. So, you know, when someone says ribs, we think of these things up here that are attached to our sternum. But the reality is that ribs are part of our rib cage, and our rib cage goes all the way around and attaches at the back to our spine. The spine is the opposite end of the sternum. And so each one of these people had broken a rib or ribs in their back. And what that did was, think of a tension pneumothorax as the opposite of a sucking chest wound. So a sucking chest wound is some foreign object, a bullet, a shard, a tree limb, something penetrates into the thoracic cavity and allows air to escape. And there's a certain amount of pressure that keeps everything going right in here. You know, at the bottom of these ribs is this dome. That dome seals off that thoracic cavity at the bottom. That dome is a word that translates to fence. It's your diaphragm. And in a sucking chest wound, you know, you cover it up and all is good. However, I was doing a little research on this. I want to get this right if I can. I get so few things right. And I was looking at a website today. I'm not finding what I thought here it is. Nope, I lied. Well, this one website was talking about a sucking chest wound as you'll hear sucking or hissing, but it's not deadly unless it becomes tension pneumothorax. So what you have to do when you, I need to let my dog in or he's going to make noise. Come, Marky. So what you need to do to deal with a sucking chest wound is to cover it up and seal it. However, what you have to worry about is that you might then accidentally create a tension pneumothorax. So that's, in this case, you had these ribs that were penetrating the pleural into the pleural cavity, and on the exhale, there would be blood that would seep into this. They think of it as a container. That container, your thoracic cavity, has your heart, your lungs, and your heart, your thalamus on top of the heart. You start to bleed into there. A lot of times the bleeding is coming from a lung being punctured. And you start to bleed into there, and what will happen is it'll create pressure and it'll collapse a lung. And then it'll keep creating pressure if it's not relieved, and it'll collapse the other lung, it'll displace your heart. It's a death sentence is what it is, unless you relieve it. And what it takes to relieve it is a properly placed needle that, now we're talking about penetrating the skin, etc. You need a degree to do that. And so that's why they don't teach you about it in first aid, because you can't treat it. But it's very unfortunate they don't treat you about it, because you can diagnose it. If you got somebody with a bunch of pain in their chest, whether it's the front or the back, and they start to experience difficulty breathing, then you have to suspect that they've got tension pneumothorax, and your job is to get the cavalry in there ASAP. And so that's my motivation for telling this story.
So you'd suggest that first aid courses mention that if you hear these symptoms from your patient, that the way to fix it is really just to get them to medical attention as soon as possible.
Absolutely, absolutely, and don't carry them out. If if I had been a more Seattle-like personality and I had given in to this young, aggressive male who wanted to carry these people out, I absolutely believe they both would have died from, it would be death by rescue. They would have gotten jostled around in a way that would have made their problem so much worse, so much faster. They would have been dead before they ever got down to the end of the trailhead.
And what were the symptoms again? You said that it sounded like a sucking noise.
Nope.
Oh no, it was okay. Sorry, that was the chest wound. Right.
It's an open chest wound. So
Okay.
this is all internal. You see nothing, but there's been some kind of a trauma that would cause a rib, most likely, to penetrate something else internally, and that that will cause some fluids to enter the cavity, and so they'll have increasing difficulty breathing, or any difficulty breathing. If they've got a combination of anything in the, from the rib cage on up, front or back, if they've got a combination of pain and or difficulty breathing, then you have to suspect tension pneumothorax. And your first job is to get them out of there as gently and as fast as you can. And so if that were to happen to me today, I would pull out my cell phone and I might possibly set off my PLB at the same time. But I would do everything to get a helicopter in there ASAP to get them out.
Hey, Bob, question for you.
Yeah.
Is this another term for this, a sucking chest wound?
No, sucking chest wound is the opposite of it. It's called a tension pneumothorax.
Yeah, I added a link to the chat to a page that has more info on this specific issue. KP is raising their hand.
Hey. Hi, thanks for sharing so far. I wanted to add a couple comments. I'm an ER doc by training.
Oh, good, thank you.
Now,
they're talking.
Yeah, I mean, both of your victims had such a deadly diagnosis that I would recommend that anyone who has the training would put a needle in their chest. I think that you were very lucky that your second victim survived, because typically you don't have much time when your pneumothorax goes from plain pneumothorax to tension. And tension basically is kind of the beginning of the end. What happens, like you were describing, is the rib will puncture the lung, so there's bleeding, but there's also air that escapes with blood because your airways get ruptured. So the leaky air builds up a big pocket, and that's what crushes the lung. And so if you place a needle in the correct space, and training would tell you where to do that, you would hear a hiss of air escaping, and the tension is deflated, and it becomes a regular pneumothorax. And that will buy you time and will also save a life. But once you get to tension, your time is very limited. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you.
You bet.
Yeah, that's super great perspective. Thank you so much.
So I thought I would spend a few minutes talking about, well, what did I learn? So this is one of the few visual aids I have. This is a picture of Mount Austerity. It's up in the Adamants. Friends of mine, I started climbing with the Appalachian Mountain Club in New York at the Gunks. And we were just a small group. There were no more than 50 of us. And maybe there were, I don't know, 5 to 10 of us newbies. And so Ed Nestor and Julius Beatty went to do a new route on Austerity, which is up in BC in the Adamants. And they pushed the route to a certain point, and the route is sort of on the Repel route for the easier, more well-established route. This was in 1978. And so now they decided, well, we're pushing it, it's getting dark, we're not really prepared to keep going on, we can always come back, let's wrap off. So they set up a standard Repel. I mean, this monster block, car-sized block. They set up the Repel. They basically back up the regular Repel, and Ed goes and he comes off of that, and the next thing you know, there goes Ed and the block, and Ed died. And here's Julius, who is one of the toughest guys I know. And Julius is up on this ledge, no ropes, and nobody around. And about a day later, off in the distance, he can see there's out on a trail, there's a party of 3 or 4 people. And Ed, whose mouth is a little dry at this point, starts screaming like crazy. And he's, waving his arms, and he's doing everything he can to get their attention. And they can't hear him at all. And so after that incident, I made it a point of always carrying a whistle on my harness, not in my pack, on my harness. My pack could go somewhere. I could get stuck halfway up a pitch. It didn't matter. I wanted it on my harness, and it doesn't matter to this day whether I'm fly fishing in river, or I'm whitewater rafting, or I'm out in the wilderness climbing or scrambling or whatever. If I'm away from the road, I've got a whistle on my body. And we would not have, these people would have been dead right off if we didn't have all those people to do CPR. I have carried a PLB, I want to say for 15 years now. The one I carry happens to be a McMurdo. I found it by checking out private pilot blogs. And this is what seems to be the popular one for people in planes that don't have black boxes, kind of a thing. And my cell phone I carry in a Fuzi, which is just a brand, PHOOZY. It's an insulated cell phone carrier when I'm skiing or if I'm up in the mountains. And so it'll extend the life of my battery.
So why did you choose a PLB from pilots, I guess, for pilots?
Oh, so, PLBs fall into 2 categories. There are the PLBs that are just monitored by the same people who monitor planes, and when something goes off, then the cavalry comes ASAP, no questions asked. And then there are the PLBs that are privately monitored by networks, and you can communicate with your family to say, I'm okay, we're late, blah, 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 blah. And I'm from the old hard man school of deluding myself into thinking, well, small stuff we can take care of. We'll get ourselves out. But here's a way, if all goes to heck in a handbasket, I can get them in here. And so I wanted something. I didn't care so much about being able to communicate back and forth. Even though my software experience goes back to 1970, and I had the software company for 10 years in the 90s, nonetheless, I come from a pre-software and pre-internet era, and we relied on ourselves to get things done. And what I cared about was, how do I get people in here when I really need them? And I don't want to rely on some third party who might be asleep at the wheel. It's happened more than once. Spot, and things like that are not 100% reliable. There are people who have called in problems to Spot, and they've not gotten the response that I want. So that's why I chose McMurdo, because it's directly tied into the satellite network globally. Doesn't matter what continent I'm on, it's tied into the satellite network that always gets a response, and it always gets one quickly. They do know who I am, because the battery's good for 6 years. I have to have it registered with NOAA. So NOAA knows who I am. They know if I'm a plane or an individual or whatever. But that's why I use that. One of the other things I learned is don't believe everything you read about accidents. So this accident was written up in the Bellingham News as a crevasse fall. It wasn't a crevasse fall. It then got picked up and written up in the annual Accidents in North American Mountaineering as a crevasse fall. I wrote a correction that got published the following year as to what it really was, which was incorrect. Well, it was a fall compounded by an incorrect order descending. The leader should have been at the back, not the front. Let's see, since I mentioned tension pneumothorax, I'll mention another thing along the same lines, which is compartment syndrome. So compartment syndrome is, you've got some parts of your body, for example, your lower leg, in which the muscles are contained. And if you do damage to those muscles, and you start to create pressure inside that compartment, then the results can be severe, as in you might lose a leg. So if you have somebody who smashes their leg, don't waste any time in getting them the heck out and take them to a hospital. Don't let them go, oh, it's okay, and try and shake it off and minimize it. Get them to a hospital. Another thing you should know about first aid is go and Google, or Bing, or whoever you use, but do an online search for Israeli bandage. Again, I never leave home without one, and I'm not going to take the time to go into those. You'll look it up. And then the last thing is, so after this incident, I found I was climbing less. I never went back to do the head wall, although, let's see, the winter after that winter, so 2 winters later, I did do a solo climb on Baker. But I found, I just didn't have the same feeling about climbing, and I never at that time put it together, because at that time we didn't have a term PTSD. But looking back on it, I'm quite confident that I had PTSD. And that was what led to a drop off in my climbing for a handful of years. So I'm going to make one more comment before I stop to take some questions. But so for those of you who are basic students, my recommendation is when you need to do your glacier climb, don't do Rainier, do Baker. When you get to the summit of Baker, you are approximately at the level of Camp Muir. The difference is you're going to be happy and feel good. You will have a great experience. You'll have learned about things like glacier travel. You'll have experienced altitude. You'll deal with crevasses. And the best news is, if it's a nice day, you will have the most incredible view you can imagine. You look to the east, and you will be seeing a view that is the most photographed and drawn view of any mountain in the United States, which is the northwest view of Mount Shuksan. And you'll see the Coast Range up to the north, and you'll see the North Cascades off to the east, and you'll see the San Juan Islands off to the west. If you're on top of Rainier and it happens to be a clear day, that's not the kind of view you're going to get. So my appeal to those of you who are climb leaders is schedule more Baker climbs for these basics to be able to take for their glacier experience, and you'll both have a much better time. So why don't we stop for a moment and see if there are any questions before I move on to talk about Sir Donald.
Not seeing any questions in the chat either.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess we can move on to
Sure.
Sir Donald. And then I just also wanted to let you know that we're at it's 7:51 right now, and we're going to be ending at 8:30. And I did really want to also hear your advice on dealing with fear. So I just wanted to remind you of that.
We're coming up to that.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Bob.
Oh, my pleasure. So yeah, I figure if there are no questions, they're either all drunk or asleep. So then after a number of years of little or no climbing, I returned and found that my regular climbing partners had all stopped climbing, which, you know, back then, and we're talking about the time, this was 1988. So that's a year before there were any indoor climbing clubs. The vertical club that became Vertical World started in '89. It was only 4 years after the invention of the cordless Bosch Bulldog impact drill, which made bolting reasonable and basically led to the beginning of sport climbing. It was at the time that there were good rock shoes that actually were sticky. People were using belay devices instead of hip belays. A lot had changed. But back when I had been climbing, it was generally accepted that the average active time of a climber was about 5 years. So it wasn't a surprise to me that my regular climbing partners were no longer climbing. Maybe more surprising was that I had any interest to still climb, but I did. And I was lucky. A guy came into our office as a new employee, and I discovered that he had some experience climbing. He could lead. He could climb up to 5'7", and he spent most of his time scrambling, but he had the skills to lead and to climb 5'7". I said, okay, well, I'll take that. So we did a number of routes locally, and then I thought, well, it would be fun to go back up to the Bugaboos. I really enjoyed an earlier trip I had to the Bugaboos. I showed him some pictures. You see pictures of the Bugaboos, how could you not want to go to the Bugs? So I got him hooked, and we made some plans that we were going to go up there in August and climb. So we do, and we get there. The weather is great. We are there 4 days. We knock off 4 climbs. We have a fun time, and we get back down, and I ask the climbing ranger what she knows about the weather forecast for the next week. She says, well, the next 5 days look like they're supposed to be as good as it gets. So I turned to my partner, Dave, and I said, Dave, there's a climb that I've always wanted to do. It's an easy climb, and it's a spectacular climb. It's in 50 classic climbs, and I think we should go up and do it. It's less than a day's drive away. We could do the drive and the approach in one day, do the climb the next day, and it'll be great. He said, okay, count me in. By the way, what is it? So I tell him it's the Northwest Ridge of Sir Donald. He says, great, I've never heard of it, but let's go. So I had, Sir Donald is now considered a grade 4, 5-4 rated X. It's 2,400 feet. And when I first heard of Sir Donald, which was before the existence of the book 50 Classic Climbs by about a year or two, my earliest climbing mentor in Washington, Sean Rice, who was a mountaineer, when I was 30, he was 50, and he had been climbing for 25 years. And we had spent summer, well, in the previous summer, we had spent a month in Yosemite together and 10 days in the Sierras. And during that time, at one point, I asked him, what should be on my hit list? And the first thing he responded with was the Northwest Ridge of Sir Donald. And he had climbed it. He highly recommended it. He said it wasn't climbed all that often, but it was a beautiful line. And he knew that I was highly intrigued by beautiful lines. He said, it's a beautiful, pure climb. And he said, I've known lots and lots and lots of mountaineers who've gone up there to do it, and they don't succeed. Why not? He said, you don't go up there now. He said, you want to wait to the point where you feel really comfortable on rock, and you can third class, fourth and easy fifth class rock and feel really comfortable about it. He said, the reason they don't succeed is it's 2,400 feet long. It doesn't always have good places in terms of setting up belays. If you start at the bottom and start belaying from the bottom, you'll never get it done. He said, you've got to be able to third class a certain amount of it. Now, back then, we didn't do simul climbing. That was not a concept yet. And so I just, tucked that away in the back of my head. And so I thought what I would talk about is what got me to the point before I said to Dave, let's go up to Sir Donald. What got me to the point where I felt comfortable and knew, this is not going to be a problem for me. And because Dave was a scrambler, he was used to doing a lot of airy kinds of stuff. Well, first of all, I started out climbing in the Gunks. And where you start climbing makes a big difference. If you start climbing in the Cascades, you could do a lot of climbing without feeling a lot of exposure. In the Gunks, I hope you can see this. It's got Can you see that? Or is it too much reflection?
I did see a moment ago. If you pull it back a little bit, maybe. Yeah, okay.
Okay. That is a 5-6 route. And it's about 200 feet long, and the whole thing is like that. Yeah, I'll show you a different picture, but it's not head on. This is the crux of a route called high exposure. And everything is vertical. I mean, you could climb. There are at least a dozen to 20 5 zeros. They're totally vertical, but they're a staircase. And there were 5 1s, and there were 5 2s, and there were 5 3. There are 20 at least of all of these grades. They're all vertical. And then when you start to get to the 5 6s and up, they are all have an overhang at the top. So I was accustomed to a lot of exposure, but I started to think about, okay, when I get gripped, how can I deal with that? So I started to think about it, and over time I came up with my own toolkit to help me to overcome my fear when it managed to rear its ugly head. And as you know, it does do that. So my belief is fear has both a conscious and an unconscious component. There's that little voice in your head talking to you. Go down, go down. There's and that conscious voice doesn't let you focus on the important thing, which is what do you have to do next to get past this problem. It doesn't allow you to problem solve. It doesn't allow you to focus on the mechanics of, okay, I got to put my foot there, I got to put my hand there, this is what the next move is going to be. But there is a large unconscious component that's largely driven by your autonomic nervous system. And so, your adrenaline starts pumping. How do you know your adrenaline starts pumping? Well, your heart goes a bit faster, but more importantly, it creates this lousy taste in your mouth that your brain knows to interpret as we're supposed to be scared. And you start to, your hands will sweat. You'll start to breathe faster. And so these are all cues that signal to your mind to be afraid. And when I came to this realization, I thought, okay, so how do I deal with that? And, if you're Freudian, then you deal with things in terms of gaining insight into causes and then using that insight to create behavioral change. But if you're a behavioralist, there's nothing that says you don't have to understand the reason why. You can still do things to change the behavior, and that'll help you to deal with the other things later. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to remove or reduce those cues of fear. So the first thing I did was I used to, these days I carry lifesavers. I used to do, I forget what the brand was, but they were butterscotch. Every time I led a pitch, I put one in my mouth. And so if the adrenaline started, all I tasted was butterscotch. I also focused on belly breathing, which does 2 things. Number one, I know a really good climber who once said to me, we were watching some climbing competition. And my daughter used to compete as a junior. She was on the US World team 3 times. and competed internationally. And so I was with this guy and we were watching a climbing competition. He said, you know the difference between the guy we're watching now and the last guy? And the guy we were watching, when he said this, completed the route that no one else had completed, but the last guy had come closer. I said, what do you think of this? He said, I don't think it's because he's any better a climber. He said, I think that he has more aerobic fitness and that he's able to bring more oxygen to his muscles. And so his muscles have lasted longer than the last guy did. They were both as skinny as one another, and they seemed to have equal competence. One guy fell off not because he couldn't figure out the sequence, but because he just ran out of juice. And so one of the benefits of deep breathing, besides creating this, fast breathing tells your brain, this is what happens during fight or flight. Then there's the relaxation reflex that you do in yoga. That's deep belly breathing. So you can do that while you're climbing. You just have to learn to develop a habit of doing it. I am a believer that the brain can not multitask. We think it can multitask, but if you occupy your brain with one thing, it pushes everything else out. And so what I try and do is occupy my brain either with singing a song to myself. People may think it's strange, but those of us who climb know how perverse our brains are. And so my favorite song typically is Paul Simon's Slip Sliding Away. But when I'm not singing that song, it's because I'm having to focus on what am I going to do next, or I'm assessing some situation to make a judgment about it. And let's see. So in addition to these little tricks to deal with the autonomic nervous system, the other things that I did was, and part of this is thanks to a bunch of things I did with Dan Cawthorn. Dan was a co-founder of Vertical Club, a great climber, great teacher. He wrote a book at the time that I was working with him. Dan and I became climbing partners for a while, a number of years. And, but Dan was a much better climber than I was. It's always good to have a belay slave. And Dan wrote a book that the Mountaineers published that was from, I think it's called From Gym to Crags. But in any event, some of the things that I learned through him was, number one, let's say you're a 5'7" trad leader. You can change the numbers to fit your personal situation. So, and you want to climb harder. So part of getting comfortable on rock and climbing harder is, number one, do a whole lot of leading on 5'5" to 5'7", where you're comfortable. And then follow as much as you can on 5'8" to 5'10". And the more pitches you get under your shoes, the more your brain just gets accustomed to that. And if you combine that with the other things that I mentioned, you'll be in a much better place. The other thing is getting good with your feet. So for those of you who are intermediate students, graduates, climb leaders, and you're teaching other people to climb and have gone through it yourself, what I have always found is if I had to bet in any given class of beginning students or intermediate students who will become better faster? My money is always on the women. And the reason for that is because guys tend to start out approaching climbing, relying on their strength. Women don't think in those terms, and so they start out approaching climbing with technique, and they do what they're told, and they focus on their technique. Guys, when they have a problem, well, they just pull out the bigger hammer and they pull harder. And that'll get you the 5.7. It's valuable above 5.9, but also, you know, all the strength in the world is not going to make you a 5.10 plus and above climber. That's when you need technique plus strength. Although you can climb 5.10 if it's not overhanging, all on technique without a whole lot of strength. But in any event, I don't know, some of you might know whom Brian Bordeaux is, but Brian's a buddy of mine, and Brian said to me one time, the thing to focus on is foot precision when you're climbing in the gym. And so, for example, play a game with yourself at the start. I'm going to place my foot, but I'm never going to move it. Wherever my foot goes down, that's where I am, period. And so learning to become really precise with your feet. Dave, who did the climb with me on Sir Donald, prior to his life in software, he had been a professional ball player. He was in the minor leagues. And I asked him, how do you get to be such a good ball player that you ended up in the minor leagues? He said, well, when I was a little kid, my dad said to me, don't worry what you look like and don't worry about what other people think. You need to spend most of your time practicing doing the things you don't do well. The reality is most of us focus on the kind of positive feedback that we get in doing the things that we already know how to do well. And we don't spend anywhere near enough time in training. I mean, that's what training should be about. When I look at people going to the gym, I don't see a lot of people, for example, coming in, putting on their shoes, going up to the wall, doing a little traverse, getting warmed up for about 5 minutes, then getting on the wall and without climbing around. How long can you just stay on the walls before you have to come down? Or going over to a wall that is a bit of overhang and doing laps, just doing a circular lap on an overhanging wall, then doing it in reverse. Do a lap, do it in reverse. I see people going and climbing routes they can climb, climbing routes that are a little harder than they can climb. I rarely see people going and climbing routes that they know they cannot get up and hang dogging and working it and working it and working it and never getting up, but learning from the experience of trying something that's harder to the extent they know they can't get up it. So it's important to train to your weaknesses. Then train specifically for climbs you're going to do and where you're going to do them. If you're going to go climbing in Yosemite, you want to do all of your climbing locally and in the gym on a bunch of cracks and off-widths, because that's what you're going to be climbing in the valley. You know, if you're going to go to Smith, you want to be doing a lot of face climbing. And then my other recommendation is climbing outside the Cascades. And the reason for that, and this is not talking about an area like Index where you've got sustained routes of a couple of pitches. If you want to get better and you want to get in a lot of rock climbing, then go places like Red Rocks or Yosemite or Boulder Canyon and those areas. And there are lots of places you can go where there's much more sustained climbing. You know, most of the Cascades are a great place to learn to become an excellent mountaineer. You will learn your way around mountains. You will learn a lot of what you need to know to climb in the mountains. But what you won't get a lot of is the kind of, you know, there aren't that many 6-8 pitch climbs of 5-8 in the Cascades where there's nothing less than 5-6 on it. There are some, but there aren't a lot of them. And so I you know, boy, the Wind River's great place to go, a place I wish I had spent more time. So we were up in the Bugaboos, we had stable weather. I was psyched to go to Sir Donald. We drove to Rogers Pass and we had a small rack and a rope. Here's all the beta. We went up the trail. We turned at the obvious climbers trail that took us to the base of the climb. We had a comfortable bivvy the next morning. We started up the ridge and things were easy. And we had agreed that we just third class until either one of us felt uncomfortable. And at that point, we would take out the rope. And so 3 hours later, there we were standing at the summit. And the beta is go to the bottom of the ridge and climb the ridge until you get to the summit. There's not much more to Sir Donald. The less belaying you have to do, the better. If you have to simul climb it, then you're probably not ready to climb it. It doesn't mean you can't climb it. It doesn't mean you won't be successful. But I personally think the best way to climb Sir Donald is when you are in the mindset that you're just comfortable getting up on with some air under you, getting up on this 2,400 foot ridge and going. The holds are all there. There is nothing hard to be encountered. If your head is in the right place, you will be on the summit if you have the weather. And you're not going to find, even today, my understanding from reading blogs that I've read recently, it is still not a summit that many people get to the top of. It's awfully amazing. If that was close to home, boy, you would probably see more summits in 2 weeks than you see in a year in the regular climbing season. It's pretty amazing. So of all of this, the beta that I haven't covered is call the climbing ranger up at Rogers Pass ahead of time, or call the ranger station, and make sure that the trail is not being cut off because of bears. Otherwise, you'll have taken a long trip for nothing. As with the Bugaboos, you always need to bring enough chicken wire to surround your car. The chicken wire is so that the porcupines don't eat your tires, your hoses, your anything rubber that's underneath your car. Otherwise, you come back to a car that's not a lot of fun, especially in the Bugaboos where it's a umpteen-mile horrible logging road to get up into it from anywhere. And if you are going to the Bugaboos and you like to sleep, then don't stay in the cane hut because you'll never get any sleep with all that snoring. You can stay near it. There's a potty you can use. You can socialize in there. You might even be able to use their propane stoves, but don't sleep in there. So I'm going to stop there and take any questions there are. They must be muted. I'm not hearing snoring.
So we're just,
climb.
sorry, what was that?
I'm saying, other than the Baker thing, what was your most memorable climb that you kind of just, somebody says something, you just kind of go back to that one?
Well, I wouldn't go back to it in that I stopped doing technical climbs 2 years ago and I'm 72 now. And also the climb is not the same climb that I did, in that the rock fall on the northwest face of Half Dome has made some changes to the route, but I would still very, very highly recommend the northwest face of Half Dome. Now, I have to say this, you hear me say that, and some of you for sure are going to be thinking there's no way I'm ever going to climb the northwest face of Half Dome. I'll tell you right now, I know people like Tommy Caldwell and John Krakauer and a whole bunch of other people who are amazing climbers, and I've climbed with some of them. I'm as ordinary a climber as you'll ever find. I've never led anything over 10A, and those have been a handful. And I've never climbed a 511 outside of a gym in my life. So many of you who are listening to this can climb harder than I can. It takes a little bit of messing around to learn C1 aid. But the better a climber you are, the less aid you need to do the northwest face of Half Dome. And it's an amazing climb. If you're asking about climbs in the Cascades, my favorite climb in the Cascades is still Snow Creek Wall. And the way I recommend doing Snow Creek Wall, and here's some beta, is do the remorse start till you get to the beginning of the, well, what would ordinarily be considered, I believe, the third pitch, but it's really the beginning. It's the 5/8 crack, the crux pitch of outer space. And at that point, instead of doing remorse, because I believe remorse goes well off to the right, outer space goes straight up. If you go just around the corner to the right, there is a crack there. Might even be described, I wish I had it better in my mind, whether it was a crack or a little corner. But it turns that pitch from what had been a single 5/8 move on outer space, followed by easy climbing till you get to the 5/9 traverse. This becomes sustained 5/9, coming off the deck, up to the traverse, to the belay. And it really adds something to the rest of the climb and turns the whole thing into a very sustained 5/8, 5/9 kind of a climb. And of course, you get the wonderful crack and chicken heads and everything else at the top of outer space. As long as I'm talking about it, there is a variation that I'll mention that I particularly enjoy, that is on the west ridge of Prusik. And so, you know, you've got that top pitch where you're on a ledge, you traverse around to the right, come around the corner to that squeeze chimney. Well, that's a classic squeeze chimney that you don't find many places, and you should experience that once. But after you've experienced it, if you're thinking about you're going to be doing a Yosemite trip, you want a nice little off-width to mess around with, training for that. When you're on that ledge, don't traverse to the right. Just go straight up to the summit. It's not that long, but it's there's a 5/8 hand jam off-width. That's a really, really nice pitch. But the other thing that I'll add is beware 5/9. Now, I'm not talking about modern 5/9, I'm talking about any route that was done before 1990. If it was rated 5.9, and the further back you go, the sketchier it becomes. 5.9, you never know if 5.9 is 5.8 or 5.11. And a lot of times it was because people just didn't think that they should call it 5.10, or what was a 5.10, or what's the difference between a 9 and a 10A and a 10B, and things started to get a little wonky at a certain period of time. And so there are, especially in the valley, there are a bunch of 5.9s that are real sandbags.
So Bob, I have a question.
Could you speak a little louder?
Well, I'll try. This microphone is not a great microphone. Anyway,
I can
in
hear you.
1995, I was up at St. Donald, right on the base of the climb, and it was drizzling. And I always wondered, were we right to just back off that? I was assuming that it was just an unreasonable thing to do in slight drizzle.
I would have raced you to the car. You
Oh,
were that was a totally righteous call. So Sir Donald has the reputation that when it gets wet, it gets slicker than snot. And there's a Repel route on Sir Donald, and one of the things, and I didn't know about this at the time, I don't know if it existed at the time, but in any event, when you read about the Repel route, they talk about how there are gaps in the Repel route where you are just scrambling from where the Repel leaves you off to the next Repel anchor. And if the rock is wet, you have to be excessively careful getting from one point to the other on that Repel route. So I'd say that was a righteous call.
all right, that's comforting. So how many rappels did you take?
None.
I've heard of people down climbing the whole thing.
Right. We went up. We spent about 45 minutes enjoying the view all around us. It was a beautiful 360 view, and then we down climbed it. We never took the rope out of the pack.
Ah, good for you.
And we had no intention of soloing this route. To this day, I still look back on it and pinch myself.
Awesome. There's a question in the chat from Donald. He said, if you're leaving from Seattle, how many days would you recommend you give yourself to drive to Sir Donald Summit and drive back home?
Well, depends how young you are. You could drive there in a day. You know, it's a long drive, but you could drive there in a day. And there are people who do the climb car to car in a day. And so in theory, you know, if I was Mark Cruz, I would do it in 3 days, but I'm not. And so I'd say that 3 days is your minimum. And more realistically, I think of 4 to 5 days. And right now it's a moot point since we can't get into Canada.
Another question from Tony was, how long was the approach from car to base?
I don't know. I frankly can't remember other than to say, you know, it was only a few hours. Like I said, you know, I think it's something like 3 hours. There are people who leave their car by headlamp and get to the base, time it to get to the base to climb at sunrise. And I assume that we're talking about August, because you don't want to do it when there's still snow on the route, and the snow will last there. So the things that I've been reading recently, because I've been trying to catch up on Sir Donald these days, conforms to that.
Any other questions? 'Cause
Well,
I
Bob,
have-
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Ted.
I was going to ask, when did you know it was time to stop technical climbing? If you saw my face, you'd understand my question.
It was a simple decision. So I had told my wife, who has never climbed, she happens to have a prosthetic leg and has never climbed. I told her that I was going to stop climbing when I was 65 because I had tortured her enough with my being gone and her worst fears. Unfortunately, all of my techniques about how to get comfortable climbing did nothing for her. So I told her I was stopping at 65. And then just as I'm on, and I had so for the last 20 years, we've had a cabin in the Tetons, just this side of the Tetons, looking out right at the Tetons. And my regular climbing partner lives in Wilson, used to be a co-owner of Jackson Hole Mountain Guides. And so we did a lot of climbing in the Tetons and other places. And but I told her 65, I'm going to stop. And when I'm on the verge of stopping, our daughter falls in love with a guy who is a big wall climber, and B, even in his spare time, manufactures specialty big wall equipment. So I said to her, well, I'd stop, but we really want to have the kids want to come out to the cabin and visit us in the summer. And I should do a few climbs with Donnie before I stop. Well, that dragged things out for 5 years. And so I ended up stopping when I was 70, not because I had concerns about me stopping, even though I realized that I'm not who I was, but I could compensate for that in my choice of climbs, in the level of leading I did. Frankly, when I stopped, I was leading as hard as I ever led. My climbing, I wasn't feeling quite as strong, but that was partly only because I wasn't training as hard. And my brain still does move a little slower. And so I have to think more about things that before came as second nature. And so I would definitely be slowing down regardless, but that's my story. So I don't think I'm of much help to you other than make your wife happy.
Okay, well, we are a little bit past time. I did want to ask one question just because it came up earlier. You had mentioned that you said that when you had like a group of climbers, you could tell who was going to get better, and you mentioned that it was the women. Do you really think that it's more like gender-based, or is it, I guess, would you think of it more as like maybe the types of things that they were good at, or the way that people were socialized? Like,
this is easy. This is really easy. It is totally gender-based. So if I had this conversation with a fishing guide, and I've got a lot of friends who are fishing guides, and I've had this conversation, they'll tell you the same thing. Which would you rather have in your boat, a beginning woman, fly fisherman, or fly angler, or a man? And they will tell you every time a woman, because the women just are better at being focused on doing what they're instructed to do, and they focus on technique, whereas the men are always overpowering things, which creates all kinds of problems. It's like guys are just wired to rely on strength without thinking about it. Even when they try and not think about it, it's still something that they just automatically fall back on. I know it sounds sexist, but it's just, I can't help denying the reality of, decades of observation, not just on my part, but many, many, many other people I know who have taught physical things to men and women.
Interesting. So would you say then for male climbers who also want to advance very quickly, that what they should do is maybe be more open to not pushing with strength, but really focusing on learning technique and listening?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Technique, climbing up to a certain point, and that point is way up there. Climbing is 90% technique. And after that point, you get to the physical aspects of it. But I have never gotten to the point where I've gotten to the point where I wish I was stronger to make a particular move, but I always felt like if my technique was better, with the strength I had, I could have done it.
Good to know. Okay. I think, okay, it's 8:35, so I think I'll let people go. Thank you so much all for joining. Thanks, Bob, for speaking. I would love to continue conversations on anything that folks have additional questions about. Go ahead and drop them into one of the Mountaineers Facebook chats, or send me an email after this if you have any other questions or thoughts, and I'll send it out to the group. Thank you so much all for joining. And thank you so much, Tony, for recording.
Yeah, thank you both. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks all. Bye.